In October 1096, 20,000 souls marched singing into a forested valley 3 miles from the Sea of Marmara, believing God would deliver them victory over the Seljuk Turks. And within hours, the narrow gorge known as the Dragon's Throat became a killing ground so absolute that the bones of the dead would be piled into a monument visible for generations. Our silver-armored GoodKnight stood with the doomed vanguard of the People's Crusade, a trained warrior trapped in a mob of pilgrims who mistook faith for strategy, and he would witness the catastrophic collapse of the first wave of Crusaders to reach the Holy Land, not in glorious battle, but in an ambush so swift and brutal it would redefine the meaning of massacre in medieval warfare. This is not the story of the great princes who would later conquer Jerusalem. This is the story of the poor, the desperate, and the deluded who arrived first, led by a charismatic hermit and a demagogue who convinced them that divine favor could replace discipline, supply lines, and reconnaissance. From the submerged fortress of Kibotos, where our knight made his last stand, to the Byzantine warships that pulled the survivors from the jaws of annihilation, every moment of this tale is drawn from the chronicles of Anna Komnene, Albert of Aachen, and the underwater archaeology that has only recently revealed the drowned ruins of the camp where it all ended. Subscribe to the GoodKnight stories for more immersive journeys through history's most pivotal and tragic battles, where our eternal knight in silver armor walks you through the rise and fall of empires with storytelling designed for deep focus, reflection, or peaceful sleep. Comment below which forgotten disaster of the Crusades you'd like the GoodKnight to survive next. But for now, settle in and step back to the autumn of 1096, when the dream of Jerusalem died in the mud of Anatolia. Chapter 1. The Crossing. The GoodKnight stood on the deck of the Byzantine dromon as it cut through the dark waters of the Bosphorus, the strait that divided the world of the Greeks from the world of the Turks. The wind carried the salt of the sea and the distant smell of smoke from the Asian shore. Behind him, Constantinople rose like a crown of stone and gold, its walls catching the last light of the setting sun. Ahead, the hills of Anatolia waited in shadow. He was not alone. The deck was crowded with men, women, and children, pilgrims who had walked 1,000 miles from France, Germany, and Italy, driven by the promise of salvation and the call of Pope Urban II. They sang hymns as the oars of the dromon beat the water, their voices rising in a language of hope that the GoodKnight no longer shared. He had seen too much on the road to believe in easy victories. The journey from the Rhineland to Constantinople had been a procession of horrors. He had watched the mob, his mob fought. He had sworn to protect them, turn on Jewish communities in Speyer and Worms, slaughtering men, women, and children in the name of Christ. He had seen them burn villages in Hungary when the locals refused to sell them food. He had watched them riot in the streets of Constantinople, tearing lead from church roofs to sell for wine, until the Emperor Alexios himself had ordered them ferried across the Bosphorus to get them out of his city. The GoodKnight had tried to stop it. He had ridden between the mob and the synagogues, his sword drawn, his voice hoarse from shouting. But there were too many of them, and too few knights. The pilgrims did not listen to reason. They listened to preachers like Peter the Hermit, who told them that God would provide, that the Turks would flee at the sight of the cross, that Jerusalem was theirs by divine right. Peter was not on this ship. He had returned to Constantinople days ago, claiming he needed to negotiate for supplies. The GoodKnight suspected the truth. Peter had seen the writing on the wall and had fled before the disaster he had set in motion could consume him. The dromon's bow scraped against the shore of the Hersek Peninsula, and the ramp was lowered. The pilgrims surged forward, stumbling onto the beach with cries of relief and prayers of thanksgiving. The good knight led his horse down the ramp, the animal's hooves clattering on the wet stones. He looked south, toward the hills that rose beyond the coastal plain, and felt the weight of what was coming. This was Anatolia. This was the land of the Seljuk Turks, the horse archers who had shattered Byzantine armies and carved an empire from the corpse of the Eastern Roman world. And the good knight was standing on their doorstep with an army of peasants. Chapter 2. The Fortress of Kibotos. The camp was chaos. The fortress of Kibotos, called Civetot by the Latins, was a small, crumbling structure perched on the edge of the Hersek lagoon. It had been built by the Emperor Alexios to house Anglo-Saxon mercenaries fleeing the Norman conquest of England, but it had fallen into disrepair. The walls were intact, but the gates hung crooked on their hinges, and the interior was choked with weeds and debris. The fortress could hold perhaps 500 men. The People's Crusade numbered over 40,000. The good knight watched as the pilgrims spread across the coastal plain, erecting tents and lean-tos in a sprawling, disorganized mass. There were no defensive ditches, no palisades, no sentries posted on the hills to the south. The camp was a target, not a fortification. He found Walter Sans-Avoir, the ranking military commander, standing on the walls of Kibotos, staring south toward the dark line of the forest. Walter was a veteran of the Norman Wars, a man who had fought in real battles and understood the difference between a pilgrimage and a campaign. His face was lined with exhaustion and frustration. "They won't listen," Walter said without preamble. "I've told them to dig trenches. I've told them to post guards. They say God will protect them." The good knight said nothing. There was nothing to say. "We need to wait," Walter continued. "Wait for Peter to return. Wait for the princes and their armies. We have no supply train, no siege engines, no cavalry screens. If we march on Nicaea, the Turks will slaughter us." "Will they wait?" the good knight asked. Walter looked at him, and the good knight saw the answer in his eyes. No, they would not wait. Chapter 3. The schism, the fragile unity of the People's Crusade, shattered within weeks. The pilgrims were starving. The Emperor Alexios had provided some supplies, but not enough to feed 40,000 mouths. The surrounding countryside was a patchwork of Greek and Turkish villages, and the pilgrims raided them indiscriminately, taking grain, livestock, and anything else they could carry. The good knight rode with the foraging parties, trying to impose some order, trying to prevent the worst of the atrocities. He failed more often than he succeeded. The national rivalries that had simmered beneath the surface now boiled over. The French pilgrims, who made up the majority of the camp, clashed with the German and Italian contingents. Fistfights broke out over food, over water, over insults real and imagined. The camp became a powder keg. In early September, the Germans and Italians broke away. They elected their own leader, a knight named Reinald, and marched east with 6,000 men. They captured a small fortress called Zerigordos and sent word back to Civetot, boasting of their victory. The good knight knew it was a trap. Zerigordos was too small, too isolated. The Turks would not let it stand. And they didn't. Kilij Arslan I, the Sultan of Rum, moved with the precision of a surgeon. He did not assault the walls of Zerigordos. He simply cut off the water supply. The siege lasted 8 days. The chronicles would later record the horrors. Men drinking the blood of their horses, drinking their own urine, licking the dew from stones. On the 8th day, Reinald surrendered. Those who converted to Islam were enslaved and sent to Khorasan. Those who refused were beheaded. No word of the disaster reached Civetot. Kilij Arslan made sure of that. He killed every messenger, every scout, every survivor who might have carried the warning back to the main camp. Instead, he sent spies. Chapter 4. The Lie. The rumors began in late September. The GoodKnight first heard them in the market that had sprung up near the gates of Kibotos. A pilgrim was telling a group of listeners that the Germans had not only held Zerigordos, they had captured Nicaea itself. They were looting the Sultan's treasury, dividing gold and jewels among themselves, and the French were being left out. The GoodKnight grabbed the man by the collar and demanded to know where he had heard this. The man stammered, said a traveller had told him, a Greek merchant who had come from the east. The GoodKnight released him and walked away, his jaw tight. It was a lie. It had to be. The Germans did not have the strength to take Nicaea. But the lie was spreading, and it was finding fertile ground in the hearts of men who had marched 1,000 miles for the promise of plunder and salvation. By early October, the camp was in an uproar. Pilgrims were shouting in the streets, demanding that the army march on Nicaea immediately. They accused the knights of cowardice, of hoarding the spoils for themselves. The GoodKnight watched as the mob turned on Walter Sans-Avoir, surrounding him in the courtyard of Kibotos, shouting insults and threats. Walter stood his ground. He climbed onto a wagon and raised his hands for silence. "We will wait," he said, his voice carrying over the crowd. "We will wait for Peter. We will wait for the princes. We do not have the strength to take Nicaea. If we march now, we will die." A voice cut through the crowd. "Coward!" The GoodKnight turned and saw Geoffrey Burrell, a minor knight who had become the voice of the foot soldiers. Burrell was young, ambitious, and reckless. He climbed onto the wagon beside Walter and addressed the crowd. "The Germans are taking what is ours!" Burrell shouted. "They are looting the Sultan's gold while we sit here and starve. Are we going to let them steal our reward? Are we going to let them claim the glory that God has promised us?" The crowd roared its approval. Walter tried to speak, but his voice was drowned out. The decision was made. The army would march at dawn. The GoodKnight stood in the shadows, watching the mob cheer, and felt the cold certainty of what was coming. Chapter 5. The march. The army left Kibotos at dawn on October 24th, 1096. The GoodKnight rode near the front of the column, his destrier's hooves crunching on the gravel road that led south toward Nicaea. The morning was cool, the sky overcast, and the air smelled of damp earth and pine. Behind him, the column stretched for miles. 20,000 men, armed with spears, swords, clubs, and scythes, marching in a disorderly mass that made the GoodKnight's teeth ache. Walter Sans-Avoir rode at the head of the vanguard, his face set in grim resignation. He had argued against the march until the very end, but the mob had overruled him. Now he rode in silence, his hand resting on the hilt of his sword. The GoodKnight scanned the hills to the south. The road ran through a narrow valley, flanked by steep, forested slopes. The trees were thick, the undergrowth dense. It was perfect ambush terrain. He leaned toward Walter. "We should send scouts ahead." Walter nodded. "I've already sent them. They haven't returned." The GoodKnight felt his stomach tighten. The column marched on. The pilgrims sang hymns, their voices echoing off the hills. They carried banners emblazoned with crosses, and some had painted crosses on their shields and tunics. They believed they were invincible. 3 miles from Kibotos, the road entered the valley of the Draken River. The trees closed in on either side, and the sky disappeared behind a canopy of leaves. The GoodKnight's horse snorted and tossed its head, sensing something wrong. And then the world exploded. Chapter 6. The Dragon's Throat. The sound came first, a roar of drums and horns that seemed to come from everywhere at once, echoing off the hills and filling the valley with a wall of noise. The GoodKnight's horse reared, and he fought to control it, his eyes scanning the trees. Then came the arrows. They fell like rain, thousands of them, hissing through the air and slamming into flesh and wood and steel. The good knight raised his shield and felt the impact of a shaft striking the wood, the force of it jarring his arm. Around him, men screamed, horses screamed. The vanguard collapsed into chaos. The good knight looked to his left and saw a knight topple from his saddle, 3 arrows buried in his chest. He looked to his right and saw another horse go down, its rider crushed beneath it. The arrows kept coming, a relentless storm that turned the road into a killing ground. "Form up!" Walter Sans-Avoir was shouting, his voice barely audible over the din. "Form a shield wall! Hold the Crusader! Line!" But there was no line to hold. The vanguard was a tangled mass of panicking horses and dying men. Behind them, the main body of the army was pushing forward, unaware of the ambush, compressing the front ranks into an immovable knot. And then the Turks came. They burst from the trees on both sides of the road, mounted on swift horses, their bows singing. They did not charge into melee. They circled the edges of the column, firing arrows at point-blank range, then wheeling away before the Crusaders could respond. It was a tactic the good knight had heard of but never seen. The feigned retreat, the hit and run, the death of 1,000 cuts. The Crusaders had no answer for it. The good knight spurred his horse forward, trying to reach Walter, trying to rally some semblance of order. But the press of bodies was too thick. He was trapped in the middle of the vanguard, surrounded by screaming men and dying horses. He saw Walter Sans-Avoir ahead, still mounted, still fighting. Walter had drawn his sword and was shouting orders, trying to organize a breakout. The good knight pushed toward him, his horse shouldering through the crowd. And then he saw the arrows hit. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Walter's body jerked with each impact, the shafts punching through his mail and burying themselves in his chest and back. He swayed in the saddle, his sword slipping from his hand, and then he fell. The good knight reached him a moment too late. Walter lay on the ground, his eyes open, blood pooling beneath him. The good knight dismounted and knelt beside him, but there was nothing to be done. Walter's lips moved, forming words the good knight could not hear over the roar of the battle. And then Walter Sans-Avoir, the last voice of reason in the People's Crusade, died. The good knight looked up and saw the vanguard disintegrating. The knights were fleeing, turning their horses and riding back toward Kibotos. The infantry were scattering into the trees, where the Civetot, Turkish cavalry ran them down like animals. The good knight made his choice. He could die here, in a futile stand, or he could try to save whoever he could. He mounted his horse and turned back toward the camp. Chapter 7. The Route. The road back to Kibotos was a nightmare. The good knight rode through a river of fleeing men, their faces twisted with terror, their weapons abandoned. The Turks pursued them, their arrows finding targets even in the chaos. The good knight saw a priest stumble and fall, an arrow in his back. He saw a boy, no more than 12, trampled by the crowd. He did not stop. He could not stop. The 3 miles back to the camp felt like 30. The good knight's horse was foaming at the mouth, its flanks heaving. He could hear the Turkish drums behind him, a relentless rhythm that drove the panic forward. And then he saw the camp. The tents of Kibotos spread across the plain, white and grey in the morning light. The good knight saw women and children moving between the tents, unaware of what was coming. He saw priests celebrating morning mass, their voices rising in prayer. And then he saw the Turks. They had ridden ahead of the fleeing Crusaders, cutting through the forest to reach the camp first. They burst from the trees on the southern edge of the camp, their horses at full gallop, their swords drawn. The massacre began. Chapter 8. The GoodKnight rode into the camp and saw hell. The Turks were everywhere, cutting down anyone in their path. The GoodKnight saw a woman running with a child in her arms, and he saw a Turkish rider lean from his saddle and strike her down with a single blow. He saw a priest kneeling before an altar, and he saw the priest's head roll across the ground. The GoodKnight drew his sword and spurred his horse toward the nearest group of Turks. He struck one from his saddle, the blade biting deep into the man's shoulder. He wheeled and struck again, his horse trampling a fallen rider. But there were too many of them. The GoodKnight fought his way toward the fortress of Kibotos, where he could see a knot of Crusaders forming a defensive line. He cut down 2 more Turks, his sword slick with blood, and then his horse stumbled. An arrow had struck its flank. The animal went down, and the GoodKnight rolled free, landing hard on the ground. He scrambled to his feet, his sword still in his hand, and ran. The fortress was 100 yards away. The GoodKnight ran through the smoke and the screaming, his lungs burning, his armor weighing him down. He saw a Turkish rider bearing down on him and threw himself to the side, the horse's hooves missing him by inches. He reached the gates of Kibotos and stumbled through, collapsing against the wall. Around him, other survivors were pouring into the fortress. Knights, foot soldiers, pilgrims, all of them bloodied and exhausted. Geoffrey Burrell was there, his face pale, his hands shaking. He looked at the GoodKnight and opened his mouth to speak, but no words came. The GoodKnight turned and looked back at the camp. The Turks were methodical. They moved through the tents, killing the men, enslaving the women and children. The GoodKnight saw them dragging young girls toward their horses, saw them binding the hands of boys. He saw them set fire to the tents, the flames rising into the sky, and he saw the bodies, thousands of them, piled in the streets scattered across the plain. The chroniclers would later estimate the dead at 20,000. The GoodKnight believed it. Chapter 9. The Siege. The Turks did not storm the fortress. They surrounded it, cutting off any escape, and settled in to wait. They shot fire arrows over the walls, and the GoodKnight and the other defenders scrambled to put out the flames. They shouted insults in a language the GoodKnight did not understand, and they displayed the heads of the slain on pikes. The GoodKnight took command of a section of the wall. There were perhaps 3,000 survivors crammed into the fortress, and most of them were in shock. He organized them into shifts, rotating the defenders to give them rest, rationing them meager supplies of water and food. The siege lasted 2 days. On the first night, the GoodKnight stood on the wall and looked out at the camp. The fires had burned themselves out, leaving only smoldering ruins. The bodies lay where they had fallen, and the GoodKnight could hear the cries of the wounded, begging for help that would not come. He thought of Walter Sans Avoir, lying dead in the Dragon's Throat. He thought of the pilgrims who had sung hymns on the deck of the Dromon, believing they were marching to salvation. He thought of Peter the Hermit, safe in Constantinople, while the people he had led to their deaths rotted in the mud. The GoodKnight felt no anger, only a deep, bone-weary exhaustion. On the second day, the sails appeared. Chapter 10. The Rescue. The Byzantine fleet came from the north, cutting across the Gulf of Nicomedia like a line of white wings. The GoodKnight saw them from the wall and felt something he had not felt in weeks: hope. The Dromons were warships, sleek and fast, equipped with Greek fire projectors that could turn the sea itself into a weapon. The Turks saw them too, and the GoodKnight watched as they withdrew, pulling back from the fortress and melting into the hills. They had won. They had taken their plunder, their slaves, their victory. There was no need to risk a confrontation with the Imperial Navy. The fleet anchored offshore, and boats were lowered. The GoodKnight helped organize the evacuation, guiding the survivors down to the beach and onto the boats. Many of them were too weak to walk, and he carried them, one by one, his armor clanking with each step. Geoffrey Burrell was among the last to leave. He stood on the beach, staring back at the ruins of the camp, and the GoodKnight saw tears running down his face. "I killed them," Burrell whispered. "I killed them all." The GoodKnight said nothing. There was nothing to say. He climbed into the last boat and looked back at Kibotos. The fortress stood empty, its walls scarred by fire, its gates hanging open. Beyond it, the plain was a graveyard. The boat pulled away from the shore, and the GoodKnight watched as the coast of Anatolia receded into the distance. He thought of the bones that would lie there, unburied, until the princes arrived months later and found them piled into a wall, a monument to the folly of the people's crusade. The GoodKnight closed his eyes and felt the rocking of the boat, the salt spray on his face. He was alive. He had survived. But he carried the dragon's throat with him, and he knew he always would. Chapter 11. The Return. The Dromans carried the survivors back to Constantinople, and the GoodKnight stood on the deck as the city's walls came into view. The great dome of Hagia Sophia rose above the skyline, catching the light of the setting sun, and the GoodKnight felt a strange sense of dislocation. The city looked the same as it had when he left, but he was not the same. The fleet docked at the imperial harbour, and the survivors were herded on to the quay. Byzantine soldiers were waiting, and they disarmed the Crusaders with brisk efficiency. The GoodKnight surrendered his sword without protest. It felt lighter than it should have. The survivors were settled in the suburbs of Constantinople, in a district reserved for foreign pilgrims. The Emperor Alexius provided food and shelter, but the message was clear. The people's crusade was over. They would wait here until the princes arrived, and then they would be absorbed into the main army, or sent home. The GoodKnight found a corner of a crowded dormitory and sat down, his back against the wall. Around him, the other survivors spoke in low voices, reliving the battle, the massacre, the siege. Some wept, some prayed, some sat in silence, staring at nothing. Geoffrey Burrell was there, sitting alone in the corner. He had not spoken since the beach. The GoodKnight watched him for a long moment, then looked away. The days passed. The GoodKnight walked the streets of Constantinople, a ghost among the living. He saw the markets, the churches, the palaces, and felt nothing. The city was a world away from the dragon's throat, but the dragon's throat was all he could see. One evening, he stood on the walls of the city and looked across the Bosphorus toward the dark hills of Anatolia. Somewhere out there, the bones of the people's crusade lay scattered across the plain of Kibotos. Somewhere out there, the Turks were celebrating their victory, dividing the spoils, selling the slaves. And somewhere out there, the princes were gathering their armies, preparing to cross the strait and march on Jerusalem. The GoodKnight wondered if they would learn from the disaster at Civetot. He wondered if they would listen to the warnings of the emperor, if they would bring discipline and strategy to a war that had so far been fought with faith and fury. He doubted it, but he would be there to see. He had survived the dragon's throat. He would survive whatever came next, because that was what he did. He survived. Chapter 12. The Hill of Bones. Months later, when the princes arrived, Godfrey of Bouillon, Bohemond of Taranto, Raymond of Toulouse, they crossed the Bosphorus with their great armies and marched south toward Nicaea. The GoodKnight was with them, absorbed into the ranks of Godfrey's contingent, a nameless knight in silver armor. The army passed through Kibotos on its way to the siege of Nicaea, and the GoodKnight saw what had become of the battlefield. The Turks had gathered the bones of the dead and piled them into a massive mound. The chroniclers would later call it the Hill of Bones. It stood on the plain like a monument, a warning, a testament to the cost of hubris. The princes ordered their men to stop and pray. The good knight dismounted and walked to the base of the hill. He looked up at the bones, skulls, ribs, femurs, all bleached white by the sun, and felt the weight of memory pressing down on him. He thought of Walter sans Avoir, pierced by 7 arrows. He thought of the priest beheaded at his altar. He thought of the woman running with her child, struck down in the street. He thought of the dragon's throat, and the screaming, and the blood. The good knight knelt and bowed his head. He did not pray. He had no words left for God. But he remembered. And when the army marched on, he rose and followed, the hill of bones receding behind him, a monument to the dead that would stand for generations. Epilogue. The scar, the good knight would go on to fight at the siege of Nicaea, at the battle of Dorylaeum, at the siege of Antioch, and at the final assault on Jerusalem. He would survive them all, his silver armor scarred and dented, his body marked by wounds that never fully healed. But the dragon's throat was the scar that went deepest. It was the place where he learned that faith was not enough, that God did not protect the foolish, that the road to Jerusalem was paved with the bones of the faithful. It was the place where the people's crusade died, and where the good knight learned what it meant to survive. Years later, when the fortress of Kibotos slipped beneath the waters of the Hersek lagoon, swallowed by the shifting earth along the North Anatolian fault, the good knight was long gone. But the fortress remained, preserved in the cold, dark water, a time capsule of the disaster. And the bones remained, scattered across the plain, waiting for the archaeologists of a distant age to uncover them and tell the story of the massacre at Civetot. The good knight walked on, through the centuries, through the wars, through the rise and fall of empires. He carried the dragon's throat with him, always, and he would carry it forever. Our good knight will return. Subscribe for more.